My name is Christopher Wolf, president of the American Public Philosophy Institute. This year, we're very fortunate to have Father Joseph Koterski, theologian and philosopher. He's a member of the Society of Jesus. He's an associate professor at Fordham University, where he specializes in the history of medieval philosophy and in natural law ethics. Before taking his position at Fordham University, he taught at the Center for Thomistic Studies in the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Before that, he earned his doctorate in philosophy from St. Louis University after receiving a BA in classics from Xavier University. He also earned a Master of Divinity and License of Sacred Theology from the Weston School of Theology in Massachusetts. He's the author of many articles, and he's co-edited 5 books. Among his publications is An Introduction to Medieval Philosophy, Some Basic Concepts in 2009. At Fordham, he's been recognized for his teaching skills and was awarded the Dean's Award for Outstanding Undergraduate Teaching and Graduate Teacher of the Year Award. He's also a veteran Great Courses instructor. The teaching company has these courses that you can get, videos or audios, and he's done 3 of them, one on Aristotle's Ethics, another on natural law and human nature, and another one recently on biblical wisdom literature. And you can probably assume that if something is called a teaching company, and they're actually in business selling videos and courses, that they probably want to have pretty good teachers doing it. And you can be pretty confident that Father Koterski lives up to that. He also serves as editor-in-chief of the International Philosophical Quarterly. He's co-editor of the Fordham University Press series in Moral Philosophy and Moral Theology. And on the Fordham campus, he serves as the master of Queen's Court Residential College for freshmen. And he served 2 terms as the president of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. I should say one more thing before I turn over the podium to him, and that says I want to encourage those of you who are able to come to the continuation of the Scherer Conference tomorrow morning. All the events tomorrow morning will be in the Art History Auditorium. At 9:30, we'll begin with Matthew Wilson from SMU. At 10 o'clock, Susan Hansen, chair of the History Department at UD, will be speaking on education. Matthew's going to be talking about attitudes of religious believers toward the welfare state. Interesting subject. Then at 11:30, John Haldane of Baylor University in St. Andrews will be speaking on reasonable disagreement and civic friendship. A rather topical matter, I would say, these days. And then at 2 o'clock, Jerry Bradley of Notre Dame Law School will be speaking on religious liberty and the common good. So it's a wonderful lineup. We're really blessed to have all these people. I should just mention also that in a couple of weeks, we're going to have on April 6th, Thursday, April 6th, Judge Emilio Garza from the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, now retired, which is the second level of courts in the United States, will be speaking here, having a kind of informal conversation with students on that afternoon. Emilio's a very interesting person. He actually came in second in the selection for the Supreme Court in 1991, when Justice Clarence Thomas was selected for the Supreme Court. The second person on the list was Emilio Garza. So he's a very interesting guy. He's got an MA in political philosophy from Notre Dame, where I knew him years ago, and he'll be a great person to have. And one last thing I'll mention, especially for those who have any natural science interests, interest in the medical profession, on April 22nd, we're going to have the most recent in our series of medical professionalism seminars. And a doctor named Javier Vinales, who began as a doctor and then worked into the area of medical technology to come up with a way for doctors to communicate with each other more effectively in ways that help to maintain the personal dimension of the medical profession. We'll be speaking at a Saturday morning seminar in this hall. So actually, no, in the Hager University Center. So just a kind of preview of things to come. But tonight, we're fortunate to have Father Joseph Koterski, and so please now welcome him.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Can you hear okay in the back? Is this volume okay? Good. Well, it's a privilege to be here on the eve and the vigil of the Annunciation. Great feast, and I think very inspiring to me, because of course the Incarnation, the Annunciation, speaks to the way in which the Lord entered the world in order to transform it, in order to redeem it. It is part of our interest in Catholic social teaching that we take an interest in the world. That is, even though our sights are set on a world beyond, nonetheless, we also have responsibilities to this world, and the Incarnation is a great venue here for beginning this. Even as I get started, I'm so happy to be here at this really wonderful university. It's really a joy for me to be. I've come frequently to the University of Dallas, courtesy of Dr. Jerry Wegemer, for the Thomas More meetings here tonight, and glad to be here and see so many old friends. But a special joy, just before we started the lecture this evening, a young lady came up and introduced herself as the daughter of a friend of mine, Sophia Hazelberger, and she mentioned to me as we were talking, what her dad and mom were doing. I knew they were in Steubenville, and it dawned on me as we were talking that I baptized her 20 years ago. I was really delightful. I'm very glad you're happy here. Happy here at the University of Dallas, but a special joy. For tonight, what we've agreed is that I would talk on a practical moral vision for the American economy. Now, I don't want to try to present myself as an economist. I am not. And so that is not the strong part of this. I'd like to focus on the practical moral vision, because I believe that Catholic social teaching does have a very practical moral vision. And so the handout that you have tonight is my effort to try to explain some of these themes. In particular, I come to Catholic social teaching not out of a native interest in the subject. I tend to be a metaphysician. I do like the natural law theory. But up at Fordham, I was frequently asked to participate in the training of our Jesuit seminarians, our scholastics, in the course on social analysis. And the part I was asked to play was to look over the documents. Now, looking at papal documents can easily be a sure cure for insomnia. They are a bit of a workout to read. But there was a great discrepancy that I was noticing, and that really did perk my interest. And so much of what I've got here for you tonight is the result of being asked and forced to engage in something that I didn't intend to engage in. The discrepancy that I noticed is one that I'm sure you've noticed as well. Namely, that Catholic social teaching documents are generally thought to be the left wing of the Democratic Party or something like that. That is, it is often thought to be a tradition that is particularly focused on a certain vision, and it was a vision which I did not spontaneously share. But my happy discovery in reading those documents is that that particular interpretation of it is an interpretation of it, and I would venture to suggest not a particularly faithful interpretation of it. So what I came to discover in the course of doing this, and what I love sharing with you, and I'm in the moment on a sabbatical project trying to organize two books. One is an anthology of those documents that will, I hope, begin to correct the record, even with respect to what ought to be covered. And then secondly, I'm trying to write a monograph. I'm calling it Philosophical Underpinnings of Catholic Social Teaching, by which I mean not only a reflection on the substantive commitments, the particular concepts and philosophical doctrines that are underpinnings for the Church's vision of social teaching and the social order, but also it's a book that will have to involve what I will do here, especially in the first 2 points of the outline. I think of it as a project in hermeneutics. That is, how to read those documents and to read them correctly. On the first point, what I've listed for you is a fact that it's valuable to know when trying to get your hands around Catholic social teaching. Namely, that it is a series of encyclicals beginning around 1740, which are directed to questions about the social order. I fully believe that the fullness of Catholic social teaching goes back to the Gospels, whether it be Jesus' comments, for instance, on render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's, and other comments that the Church has had to reflect on and expand upon over the centuries. But that in the course of doing it, they rarely needed to do it in the form that we presently have it. That is, it was done in the form of reflection on the Gospels, and then reflection especially on how we treat one another. The way in which Christian community really did sponsor a certain vision of how we ought to organize ourselves, not necessarily with one particular political program in mind, nor one particular economic system, but always with a focus on family and what the family meant and how the family ought to be treated, and how the nature of politics and the nature of economics was always to serve family and culture. And I think that you can find that throughout the centuries. What prompted the encyclical tradition was two things. First, I believe it's things like the Industrial Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, and the breakup of the European political order. To put it another way, it was the death of Christendom as a juridical arrangement that required the articulation of Catholic social teaching in a new way. That is, until you had the breakup of Christendom, I think there were Christian emperors and Christian kings and Christian princes, and I think it went all the way down to Christian dog catchers, right? I mean, it was all the way down the line. But that when you no longer had a juridical order, there was need to address the question about what the church feels about these matters, and yet to address it to ways and into audiences who are not necessarily members of the immediate household of the faith, or perhaps the members of the household of the faith at all. In addition to the Industrial Revolution and the Protestant Reformation, you had the other revolutions in Europe that destroyed the old order. And in the course of all that, we had the Papal States, which finally ended in the 1870s. That is, you had various progressive steps in which they shrank. In 1848, in particular, 2 years into the reign of Pius IX, the very individuals whom he had been encouraging, elected as a kind of liberal for his day, interested in Italian unification, drove him out of Rome, and he nearly died, except that he was saved by the French troops. And when he came back to Rome and began to be the prisoner of the Vatican in 1850, until his death in 1878, suddenly you had popes who didn't have to rule in the Papal States. They bemoaned the fact for a while. I think Pius bemoaned the fact. I think Leo bemoaned the fact. I think every one of them since, first thing they do when they get up in the morning is to say, thank God I don't have to rule the Papal States. But it wasn't just that it freed them from something, that is, from the immediate cares of governance in that large respect, but it freed them for something. And I think it freed them for being a moral authority of a different sort, and especially a moral authority who had the liberty, like academics do, to think about these things, but also had a deep and profound pastoral obligation to think of them, by virtue especially of the large numbers of Catholics who flooded the cities from the country, and their own network of family and their network of established community was broken up. But now there was need to think about the social order for them and for their families and for the religion, at the same time that you needed to establish new social structures to take care of them. The things were not in place. So what I mean by the first point on the sheet is simply papal and conciliar versions of Catholic social teaching have been around for 2,000 years, but our present arrangement of it begins in the 1740s as the popes of that day are beginning to address the Enlightenment and its erroneous philosophies, and beginning to think about the social order in light of the Industrial Revolution, later the Scientific Revolution, not to mention the political revolutions. But if you've got a body of documents that is articulated over the course of 2.5 centuries by different individuals, different popes, who are responding frequently to very different and particular situations, it's a little hard to get hold of that entire teaching. Hence, I firmly believe, and hence my first 2 points, are about the need for a hermeneutics, that is, a set of principles about how to read these things. In particular, I think that the popes were doing their very best to try to articulate this and to say both what the contribution of faith and revelation was, but also what the contribution of reason and good, solid thinking about the traditions of social order were. And yet, inadvertently, I believe, the popes contributed to one of the difficulties that we have in grasping this tradition. And what they inadvertently, is one of those unintended consequences. What they tended to do is to write an encyclical about just one topic. So they might write it about economics, or they might write it about family life, or they might write it about the education of children and how that was to take place in the faith. They might write it about the political order. But what they inadvertently did by that style of composing their text is what I call the silo problem. That is, by virtue of treating the things separately, what they did for readers of it was to give the impression that there were relatively separate and discrete units. I think that's the reason why most modern presentations of Catholic social teaching tend to focus only on economic documents. That is, there's a series of economic documents, and you can indeed put them together, but it would be a mistake in my judgment to think of that as the whole or the only part of Catholic social teaching. There is also, very steadily, an effort to address questions of the political order, but that tends to be in separate documents, and to address questions of the family and of culture, but that tends to be in separate documents. You see the popes trying to keep it together by virtue of writing documents on all the appropriate items, but they don't necessarily make the connections for us. Just as one example, one of my favorites in this tradition is Pius XI. I think he's very understudied and undersung. I think he was really an intellect like John Paul II and like Benedict. I mean, I think he's of that stature. And when he's writing his documents, he writes about 25 encyclicals. But even the ones that might seem furthest afield, there's one on St. Francis of Assisi, 700th anniversary of his death. There's one on the 1500th anniversary of the death of Augustine. There's one on the Holy Rosary. But within about 3 paragraphs, he's into Catholic social teaching on any of those issues, not just the very large and important documents. The 2 for which Pius XI is best known are presumably Quadragesimo Anno in 1931, that is on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum in 1891, and Casti Connubii in 1930, which is an encyclical on marriage and family, especially responding to some things that had happened in the Anglican Communion. Within a year and a half, he's got a document on marriage and a document on economics, but they're separate documents. So what I mean to say is the popes are intending to act responsibly by addressing each of these documents and each of these problems, and they understand very clearly that there's an economic dimension, a political dimension, a dimension of family and culture, but they do it in separate documents, thereby beginning a tradition that leads to this silo problem. So that people interested in economics often don't consider much about family and family life, or that people interested in family life aren't always interested in the political documents or the economic documents. I hope the point is clear, but I find it fascinating that the popes were regularly seeing the need for treating all these things and trying to figure out ways in which they could adequately do so. In my first 2 articles there, my intention is merely to sum that up by saying, I believe that this is one of the practical aspects of this moral vision, and something that we should be alert to when we're thinking of the American economy or of anything else. Let me move to a different point. It's number 3 on your handout. When I read through those documents, if I can manage to stay awake, because I admit some of them are a little bit obscure for insomnia, when you work your way through them, I would propose that one of the things you should concentrate on is how there are paired principles. That is, when we're thinking about principles, and it's sort of another point about hermeneutics, right? Namely that in writing documents on the social condition, and in writing documents that are intended to be teaching documents, and writing documents that are intended to be practical, you need principles. And so you've got principles and applications. So at very least, in terms of the hermeneutics of this, that is the proper interpretation, one of the questions to ask is, at what level is any particular thought intended? A given sentence might be something that indeed has a very, very high level value as a principle that really does govern a whole field. And other sentences, other thoughts that are in there, could very well be about policy that pertains to a particular land or a particular time, or even very, very immediate statements about what we should do about this problem or that problem. But of course, as you descend from principles of a very general nature to the principles within a given discipline, to the policy applications, to the very specific application to a specific problem, you've got very different levels of authority that are intended. That is, some things are really there, intended always and everywhere. Others have a lesser degree of application, and many of them are matters of prudential judgment. So I think that as one enters into the field of Catholic social teaching, either looking at the documents, or looking at a compendium, or looking at an anthology, or reading anybody's book or anybody's article, I think one of the crucial things to remember and to ask is, at what level of authority are any of these assertions made? Because it would be a mistake. And I have found, at least in conversation, that this is one of the points on which I think there is much confusion. I've been in many a conversation in the Jesuit community and on the Fordham campus, in which people quoted a line or two from these encyclicals and took it as simply solid gold, absolutely standard, absolutely normative. And I found it to be a very questionable assertion. And so when we looked it up and got the context, one of the things that is really important in reading these documents or having a consideration of any of the efforts of teaching about it is it a principle? Is it a principle that is self-evident, like the principle of non-contradiction in the metaphysical order? Or is it a first principle in the ethical order, like the very first principles of the natural law? Or is it somewhere down the line? And the further you get down the line in matters of detail, the more it's a matter of prudential judgments, the more it's a matter of a judgment on a practical issue on which reasonable people can disagree. Make sense? The other part that I've tried to mention in item number 3 on your handout is that the principles, when they are stated, that is, when you work toward the articulation of these principles, they tend to come in pairs, and they need to be read and understood in pairs. Without doing that, you get a pretty funny look at things. I mean, just consider in a very different picture for a minute. Supposing you were in a course on theology, and the person who was giving the talk did it all from the perspective of the bride. Be a good thing. Brides are very important to weddings. And then you went and read a couple of books on the subject, and they did a marvelous job from the point of view of the bride. And eventually, of course, one would have to say, well, but to get a full picture of marriage, you need to make sure you also look at the perspective of the groom. Right? That is, there's a need to consider those paired principles, people with different needs who are entering into this relationship. Well, what I propose for you in number 3 is an effort to see some of these principles and to see them always in a paired way. And my hope in doing that, and suggesting these at least as some of the basic principles that are found in this tradition, is that this will be useful in the economic order when we're trying to think about a practical moral vision for the American economy or for any economy. Let me start with the first one. The demands of the common good and respect for the dignity of individual persons. This is, I think, very central to this whole tradition, because the Catholic tradition in this matter does focus on the common good, but it never does it in a way that it is done in the way the totalitarian states did it. In fact, many of these documents that emerged in the course of the 20th century were precisely the documents by which the papacy was attempting to respond to exaggerated senses of the common good. There is always a need for remembering what the real point and what the real value that any particular community wants to serve. And it is, of course, the good of individuals, each one of whom is predestined for heaven and will get there if we cooperate. On the other hand, we know that there is possibility of non-cooperation, but that there is, on the part of the papal teaching, an insistence that one always has a respect for the individual. Now, I mentioned this as a first one, and I think it has direct relevance to some of the economic questions. Here's the argument that I would present. When the Catholic social teaching tradition is looking at the question of economics, there frequently is consideration of the common good, that is, the good of a particular nation, the good of a particular region, the good of a particular corporation, and so on. And yet there are matters that have to be involved with each of the individual owners and each of the individual wage earners all the way through any particular form of employment. And that these things need to be balanced in a way that respects both of these principles. When Catholic social teaching documents address these matters, they do it in a way that accepts that there are economic principles, and yet the principles that are principles of economics, I think, tend to be descriptive principles rather than prescriptive ones. Consider, for instance, some of those very basic principles of economics, for instance, the law of supply and demand, stated as a law, and it's rightly held, I think, to be a descriptive law, namely the way in which, if there is a large supply of a given commodity, the price is going to come down, and if there is a relatively small supply, but a relatively high demand, your price will go up. I mean, it's a good descriptive law. And the popes, I think, need to recognize that and to accept it, but they also have to realize where it is that concerns with the personal good of the individual and with the common good of the community won't allow that law of supply and demand to be applied to the notion of wages, as if wages and laborers could be taken to be simply one more supply for which there is either a strong or weak demand. One sees the popes trying to articulate the principles and their application for that problem. In 1891, when Rerum Novarum is issued by Leo XIII, he is strong on making the case for a living wage. That is, he's thinking about the need for a laborer to be paid, but the rules for figuring out the payment can't be simply supply and demand. That is, if there was a large community of laborers available, the rate of wages would presumably be driven down too low beyond subsistence level. And yet his concern is stated in the form of just a wage earner. He makes some remarks about the family, but he doesn't dwell on the matter. I think he was probably presuming that a laborer would earn a wage for an entire family. In 1931, when Quadragesimo Anno comes along by Pius XI, what he does is to make a change in his predecessor's terminology, insisting that it should not be a living wage, but it should be a family wage. And he's not insisting that it be differentiated by the number of children in the family, but rather that there be appropriate provisions, if not only by the wage, then also by the tax structure, and also by various other support structures in the community, so that the person would be able to undertake really the provision of his family. What I intend by that example are two things. First, the way the popes do see the things working together, even though their net effect of treating them in separate documents could be vulnerable to the silo effect. But also the way in which the popes, although guided and kept from heresy by the Holy Spirit, we do pray that that continues in the current papacy, that this would be nonetheless something in which the particular pope does not have necessarily at the start a full vision of what the tradition will later say, so that Pius has to come and in a way revise, importantly, what his predecessor had said. I think you see that any number of times in these encyclicals. Let me just give one other example before I go to the next principle. I'm thinking especially of the way in which Papalorum Progressio in 1967 was issued by Pope Paul VI, and in which there was a tremendous optimism. Throw money at it and development will occur. But there needed to be a correction of that, and so you see not just one, but two documents aiming to correct it. Namely, in 1987, Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, issued by Pope John Paul II, is very much in the spirit of Papalorum Progressio, but is directly intending to amend and to revise to give, I think, a deeper and better picture than Pope Paul VI had managed to do. I find it fascinating that 20 years after that, there was yet another effort at a corrective. The document that was eventually issued is Caritas in Veritate, which came out in the year 2009 under Benedict. That it didn't come out in the year 2007 is significant. It's not just that the popes rather like anniversaries, but they sure do. There's lots of nostalgia there. But there was so much infighting in the Vatican about what it should contain that it was 2 years late. I think it's one of the least successful social encyclicals. That is, I don't think that it managed really and truly to negotiate all of the particular contentions that were afoot, but that part of it is directly intended as a continued effort to revise the somewhat exaggerated optimism of the initial document in 1967. Part of what I think that you see, and is probably a more valuable document from the economic perspective, is Centesimus Annus. This one also in the time of John Paul II, and it is not only about the overturning of the Soviet Union, that is a political arrangement, but it's also about the economic issues, and I think that it is probably the most helpful of the documents from the point of view of giving a practical moral vision for any form of economy, by virtue of the way in which it has a much more positive approach to what it is that our relatively free market and our relatively capitalistic system can do for the general sharing of prosperity without invoking some of the arbitrary redistributions of the wealth to which I think some people in the interpretive tradition of Catholic social teaching are inclined. Those are only two examples of what I think are many, but I'm seeing from your nods, I think that the general point is clear. What I also see in this whole list, and you can read down the list for yourself, but I see that there is, on the part of the popes, a very interesting pairing of the notion of duties and rights. It seems to me that in this Catholic social teaching tradition, on any of its aspects, on the politics, on the economics, on the family and culture issues, on any of the areas on which it makes a contribution, what you will find in my judgment, correct interpretation of these documents is a notion that for the Church, the duties come first, and the rights are derived from the duties. Now, I'll say that in two different ways, one pertaining just to what the Catholic positive doctrine is, but then secondly, when I get down to number 5, I want to talk about the way in which it's different from the social contract tradition. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later in the evening's lecture. But first, just from the Catholic, Catholic positive argument for all this, I think what it's rooted in is a very strong metaphysical picture, namely that all of creation is the gift of God. that God has created a universe, created a world, created human beings in his image and likeness, decided to indeed become incarnate as we celebrate tomorrow on the Feast of the Annunciation, entering into history not because we were so good, not because we deserved it, not because we'd earned it, but simply because we needed it. And in this persistence of the gift, namely the original gift of existence, and then the gift of all the other things since, we have, as the recipients of the gift, we start with a debt of gratitude. That is, we start with an obligation to be grateful for what we have received and to use it in the way in which the gift was intended. But it is not only that we have a gift received from God and therefore a duty to God, but also that we have the duties of the various forms of association because of our intrinsically social nature. That is, the second area of duties that we have is to take care of ourselves by virtue of the fact that God has given us a life, but especially a duties to our families, especially a duty to those to whom we've made a promise as spouses, but then a duty to those who gave us the gift of our existence, that is, a duty to our parents and to our family before us, and then a duty to those whom we brought into the world, especially in the helpless ways that a child is brought in. So again, it's a set of duties, and it's those duties that we have to God, duties to ourselves, and especially duties to our family, and then more broadly duties to the community in which we grow. I believe that it is from those duties that all the rights derive. When we think about it, let me give two examples, but I think you could give more. How about the right of private property? You will see that defended very strongly in these church documents. Rerum Novarum in 1891 makes the case against socialism. In Quadragesimo Anno, 1931, he makes the case, especially with regard to socialism and communism, which he distinguishes more sharply than Leo had done. But when they're doing it, or when John the 23rd is doing it in his contributions to the Catholic social teaching tradition, they always do it in that the right follows from the duty. That is, because we have a duty to our family, and we must take care of our parents, we must take care of our spouses, we must take care of our dependents, that's the origin of anybody claiming a right to private property. And the most complete and entire and immediate and long-standing and inviolable nature of a right that we have in the areas of property comes because we must have a right to that which we need to do our duty. Beyond that, that is when we've managed to earn things or inherit things or been blessed with things by good fortune, we still have a right to the property that we have legitimately acquired, but at that point there can be legitimate demands on it, again, because the duty includes a duty to our society. And so whether it be the demands on us in taxation for the sake of the common defense, or whether it even be the demands on us for the sake of various things for the common good, hospitals, school systems, health systems, roadway systems, the maintenance of a market, courts, and all the rest, any of the subsequent demands on us in taxation come and are justified for Catholic social teaching by virtue of the fact that duties come first and the rights are second, and there's a legitimate limit on the right. Let me offer one other example before I push on. Even the right to life. I suspect that everybody, or almost everybody in this room, is deeply committed to the pro-life movement and contributes in a particular way. And in America, we frequently use the language of rights when we're talking about that question. That is, it's very valuable for us to use the language of rights. And I don't in any way deny that we should do it. I think we should do it and find appropriate ways to do it. But when we're thinking the matter through for ourselves, and really trying to understand what our church teaches, and really trying to understand what reason demands, and really trying to think through some of those great difficult cases that come up, I believe that the right to life is also derived from the duty. That is, what the duty is that we must never deliberately attack innocent life. See, if we don't say it that way, at least for ourselves, and really think it that way, namely that there's a duty that is first, the duty never to attack, and sometimes very positively the need to defend innocent human life. If we don't say it that way, we get ourselves into the philosophical pickle of thinking about, well, what is the justification for the use of lethal force in self-defense? I believe that we have a right to use lethal force in self-defense when public authority is not there. But if public authority is there and engaged, they are the ones who have the right to the use of lethal force under very specific protocols. Likewise, I think with regard to the national defense, there is a right to use lethal force in the conduct of a just war. We know all the rest of the details. I won't rehearse them here about what is just conduct within a war and what are the conditions for a just war. But I think that it comes from the notion that the duty is to protect the innocent life of the community against an aggressor, etc., and that this is what gives the right to use lethal force. Same thing for a police officer and any of the protocols that are used and so on. I see again from the nodding that I think we're getting the case. My point is that while we have to use the rhetoric of the right to life, and we must use it in our circumstances, that's point number 5, but in terms of thinking it through for ourselves, I don't think it's appropriate to think of ungrounded rights or free-floating rights, or even rights as if they were the basic thing. I think that it's much more part of the Catholic social teaching tradition, properly understood, to be thinking of rights as derived, correlated with various duties that we have. The rest of the examples that I provided should be fairly obvious. There are obligations in justice. Admittedly, those obligations in justice can be incurred in various ways. They might be incurred naturally, such as the obligation we have not to attack, never to deliberately attack the innocent, or the obligations we have to render what is due to the neighbor. On the other hand, there are also a set of paired obligations that we have that aren't derived in justice, but are derived in charity. This is one of those parts of Catholic social teaching tradition that I'd like to emphasize and want to spend just 1 minute on here. One of the really curious things, in my judgment, that I hear again and again in discussions about the social order are claims made in the name of social justice, and almost never claims made in the name of social charity. That is, it is as if charity didn't really oblige and only justice did, and that when we're looking to have people obliged, we want to put everything under the label of social justice. I think that that's a miscue. I really think that that's a misnomer and deceptive in some ways. That is, I think it can name something appropriate, but it's not the best name for it. And that instead, what we really need to think about are the obligations we have in justice, either those obligations that are always and everywhere, but are generally of a negative sort, or the obligations that we incur by making a contract, by making some formal agreement or exchange. And then we suddenly incur lots of positive obligations. But there are lots of other obligations that are not obligations in justice. So that when Jesus, for instance, to take the biblical root of all this for a minute, speaks about the Good Samaritan, the point of his parable is to indicate where our charity is obliged. Namely, our charity is obliged to a person in genuine need. It's not, in that text or in other related texts, any obligations about the redistribution of wealth. It's not an obligation in justice, but a true obligation in charity simply by virtue of the need. And so I would propose that when one is trying to think about these paired phrasings, part of what we need to do is to think about even the real source of the obligation. The fourth one down is quite interesting, the principle of solidarity and the principle of subsidiarity. Clearly the name of the fourth one on the left comes from John Paul and his experience in Poland, but I think that it's a much older idea than that. Namely, that we have obligations that come to us from our community and those with whom we live, those with whom we must live, those with whom we do in fact live, and there are obligations that extend even beyond the immediacy of life together and go to the people whom we hear about through the news media when disasters strike. But paired with it is the notion of subsidiarity. That is, at what level should a particular decision be made? And the principle of subsidiarity is a two-edged sword. It's the sword that allows you to say a lower level authority ought to make the decision. They'll be in a much better position, truthfully, to recognize what is it that is needed. But that sometimes you run into situations where the lower level authority either is unable to understand what's needed or unable to summon the energy or the courage or somehow the force in order to bring about whatever it is that is needed and that it's obliged. So the principle of subsidiarity allows you to go up or down depending on what the nature of the need is and how the obligation would be fulfilled. The last one is, I think, a very interesting pairing, namely the duty to render obedience to legitimate authority and the right to various things like the right to thought, freedom of religion, peaceful expression of ideas. There is an obligation in Catholic social teaching, defended especially by Aquinas, that we have positive obligations to authority. It's one of the things that I think is, again, questioned in an age like our own that's very antinomian, but that is very frequently found in the gospel and everything since. The obligation to respect legitimate authority, so long as that authority is truly aiming at the common good, granting we may have our disagreements and prudence, but then the right also to express. And this is part of what valid participation in a political order requires. On that note, let me put one footnote before I go on to the fourth and fifth points. I think this tradition is still developing. I don't think we're done. One of the things I would love to see the popes talk about with much greater clarity is the need for limited government. I was having a discussion at dinner tonight, and part of it turned on Quadragesimo Anno, and rightly so. Dr. Daugherty, I think, was the one bringing it up. And part of what we were saying and agreeing on was that while Quadragesimo Anno makes some comments about the legitimate limits of authority, it doesn't do much in that direction, and in fact it even has a text or two which could be perhaps the beginning of the trail leading to the government will solve the problem, right, the expansion of government. I would love to see there being even more development in that area, talking about the limitations of government. I think those texts are a little bit far and few between. Let me come down then to the last 2 points. First, it's the philosophical background that makes this all work. And I believe that you will find in these documents that natural law theory is the crucial theory. When one is thinking about a natural law theory, it seems to me, as I've tried to express in your handout, that what you need to think about is that a genuine, authentic theory of the natural moral law will have 3 particular points of focus. I'm taking this language especially from Professor Russ Hittinger in his wonderful book, First Grace, if you know that particular book. Namely, it needs a theological pole. God is the one who designed this law. Secondly, it needs an anthropological pole, that is, a human nature where one can find it. And by that I mean not only bodily nature, but also psychic nature, that is, our psychic developments, our spiritual developments, our bodily developments. And thirdly, it needs an epistemological pole, that is, a theory about reason, about learning, that is sufficiently strong, namely that reason is capable of discerning those norms that God has written into our nature and made normative there. Shy of these 3 poles, I think that you have various other theories, often well-meaning, often helpful, but I'm not sure that they're quite at the fullness of what a natural law theory is. In the course of giving these natural law arguments, what you find is an alertness in Thomas Aquinas and in the Church's use of Thomas Aquinas to an approach that can, at least in principle, be compelling, be really cogent for individuals who are not of the household of the faith as well as to those who are. That is, when one is thinking with them, they might not be too inclined to think about the theological dimension that God had ordered it, but that they will find, if they find it anywhere, in the fact that we have a common human nature. Much of the discussion today, which tends to run shy of the natural law, tends to focus on human rights, or basic rights, or natural rights. We'll get to that in the fifth point. But my concern is to say, given that there is a talk of a human right, how is it that any of us could have the possible grounds for saying that there's a human right unless we had a common human nature? And hence that need for a human nature to defend the claim of a right. I believe that it's derivative rather than basic, but nonetheless we're in the same ballpark if we're at least talking about it. And then secondly, that there is a capacity of the mind to discover these things. For without that, we are making arbitrary assertions. It seems to me that this is one of the particularly vulnerable parts of a rights-based approach. That is, people seem to come up with increasing lists of all rights, and it's very hard to say what is the restraint on it. Whereas, if you make it in the opposite direction, that there is a natural law that comes first, by the fact that our nature is given as a gift and must be received as a gift, with certain obligations already entailed in it, now you have a justification for making certain assertions about rights and for dismissing others from the realm of rights and putting them where they belong in the realm of privileges. That is, things that we as a society may say we want to share more broadly, and we must find the means to pay for it and the means in which to distribute it. Let me go to the final point and then stop. When thinking about all this, I find that it is just very, very valuable to remember the way in which the Church's tradition on this matter is not the social contract approach and not the natural rights approach. I think that frequently in courses of politics or readings that we do in our country, by virtue of the way in which that rhetoric of rights is not just recent, it's not just the right to life, or it's not just the rights associated with the civil rights movement, et cetera, but a tradition of speaking in terms of rights that goes back to the foundations of this country. I'm just enormously impressed by the Founding Fathers reading the Federalist Papers or some of those other documents. But in terms of really understanding the nature of the claim, I think it's important to see that the Church's understanding of rights as derivative from duties, that is truly important, but not primary. That is, they're derivative and there are limits to them, rather than that they're unhinged or primitive or prior and without any formal principle of limitation. It seems to me that part of what we're doing is trying to say that in a tradition like the social contract idea. That is, the notion that there was somehow, in most cases mysterious, in our country perhaps a little bit closer to something that can be historically recognized, fundamental agreements of those immigrants who came here and decided how they wanted to be governed, how they wanted to govern themselves. And so there is an effort on the part of social contract theory to broaden this out as the beginnings and the basis of the justification for all the various claims about duties and rights that follow. It is, of course, a curious tradition, because in its great proponents, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Hobbes, all the others, there is regularly an effort to substitute a myth of the state of nature for a biblical story about Eden. That is, there is oftentimes a deafness to the notion of the gift and the obligations that come with the gift and come with having a nature. It seems to me that we are on much better footing when we think about nature and think about it deeply. I suspect that many of you who are students here at the University of Dallas have had the occasion to read Aristotle's Physics. Can I hear the groans? Okay. But in the course of thinking about the physics and the doctrine of nature, very, very important. I don't see how you can be civilized without having really studied the second book of the physics. Right? But in the course of it, his own statement of it, I think, with all due respect to my friend Aristotle, needs to be amplified. And that the way I would amplify it is that when we're thinking of nature, what we're thinking is that inner principle of structure, typical structure, and the inner principle of typical development, and the inner principle of typical activities or operations. And by making that expansion, which I take to be a friendly amendment, I'm not trying to in any way subvert Aristotle, but to amplify the notion of what is it that is so typical, what is it that we discover when we look at nature, we're looking at things that are structural. The structure might even be biochemical, and it's part of the way in which we make a defense of the unborn, or make a defense of those who don't have the immediate, obvious perspectives or appearance of a person. Nonetheless, the nature that we have already has a structure, and it has typical patterns of development, and it has typical patterns of operation and activity. And by seeing those, one can see what it is that's really necessary for their flourishing, including the social dimension of our flourishing, because none of these patterns of activity or those patterns of development can operate in an isolated individual. What the social contract theorists don't mention, can't mention, are some of those particular theories. Their theories are generally organized around the notion of mature individuals, already adult, already in possession of certain goods, already in possession of these various rights, who surrender only the right to punish to a neutral administrator in the effort to have more secure enjoyment of the others. Again, I think that that's fine rhetoric and can often be useful in the political course, but that there is a deeper understanding of it, and I believe this deeper understanding of any of the things that are claims that are made in the natural rights tradition, if they are to be limited and integrated with the rest of life, truly have to be done from the point of view of the natural law. Let me just summarize quickly and then stop. What you've seen, in my judgment, tonight are some of these basic principles of how Catholic social teaching proceeds. And it's intended to give a practical vision. I admit it's a complex vision, because societies are so complex. But I think that it has a series of documents from which we can articulately draw these various important co-principles. And it gives us, I think, a reason for saying we've got a case that we can make that has applications, but that when we make applications, we've got to do it not in the silo fashion of just to one dimension or the other, but to all three, taking them together, making the appropriate distinctions, and thereby having a stronger case for indeed having a flourishing society, and one that can perhaps help support the work toward our supernatural end, which is, as we've said, the reason for tomorrow.